I was not born under a free sky. I was born under a decree. Before I even breathed the air of my world, my name had already been recorded by a human protocol. My species cataloged, my culture reduced to an alphanumeric code in some distant file of the central administration. I came into the universe not as a citizen of a people, but as a resource of a system. And that is where the first intergalactic dictatorship was more perfect than any empire before it. It did not see itself as tyranny. It saw itself as organization. Today, when I speak of a human dictatorship, many imagine something simple: soldiers, warships, bombarded planets. That is not how it began, and that is not how it became inevitable. It all began with information. Humans arrived late to the interstellar routes. When Earth finally managed to break through the limits of its own system, there were already dozens of civilizations spread across the spiral arm where we live. Peoples with their own wars, their own failures, their own attempts at peace. None were perfect. None were absolute. At first glance, humans seemed like just one more people, far too eager to prove they mattered. They brought with them the habit of dividing the universe into allies, threats, and opportunities. What no one foresaw was what they would do with something every species underestimated: data. While other civilizations marveled at warp energy, orbital weapons, and biotechnology, humans did something quiet. They mapped. They mapped everything. Every language they encountered was decoded, indexed, stored. Every myth, every ritual, every pattern of collective behavior was analyzed and turned into predictive models. They created observation networks that no one took seriously because they did not shine, did not destroy, did not threaten. They watched. In a short time, they possessed the most valuable thing in the cosmos: predictability. They knew which species reacted with violence in the face of scarcity, which turned to spirituality, which preferred endless negotiations. They knew which governments were fragile, which leaders were vain, which religions were easiest to corrupt. While we, the so-called ancient peoples, still believed power was measured by the range of orbital cannons, they already saw power as the capacity to edit contexts. The first act of the future dictatorship was not to conquer anything, it was to save. A great gravitational anomaly threatened to swallow a cluster of inhabited systems. The phenomenon was known, but still only partially understood. Projections indicated the destruction of 3 worlds in less than one standard cycle. That was when humanity acted. Using a combination of their predictive algorithms, technology borrowed from allies, and a cruelty still confused with pragmatism, they relocated millions of individuals to safe zones. The cost was high. They abandoned entire colonies they deemed statistically irrelevant to the overall balance of the operation. The universe called them heroes. Transmissions showed human fleets rescuing desperate populations, rerouting traffic, stabilizing platforms. Almost no one saw the worlds quietly discarded as a necessary loss. The narrative was carefully curated, and there was born what would become the hallmark of human administration: control of history. The second phase came with communication. Humans proposed something that, at the time, seemed like a natural step: unification of transmission protocols. They suggested a single standard for data flows, claiming it would make trade, cultural exchange, and diplomatic negotiations easier. Systems that had previously communicated through fragmented channels were slowly convinced, sometimes seduced, sometimes pressured, to migrate to the unified interspecies communication network. Few realized that the main servers, routing centers, and filter matrices were all under human management. At first, it was comfortable. News traveled faster. Crises were shared in real time. We watched events in distant systems as if we were in orbit. For the first time, the universe seemed like a single conversation. Then the absences began. A revolt in a mining belt disappeared from the headlines within hours. A devastating epidemic on a frontier moon was reported as a contained outbreak before the bodies were even buried. Certain political speeches never gained prominence. Certain cultural works circulated only in obscure niches. Certain questions about humanity's growing influence simply were not amplified. It was not open censorship. It was something much more effective: relevance curves. Human algorithms learned which stories kept the universe under control and which pushed it toward chaos. The former were elevated, the others were buried. And thus, little by little, what was not seen began to cease to exist. I was born at that stage. My people called our world Lethar. To humans, we were merely record Z34 Delta, species
compatible with economic cooperation, low historical aggressiveness, high propensity for cultural harmonization. These words, which I now utter with an old bitterness, meant only one thing: perfect target. I grew up listening to human transmissions, not the official ones, but those translated, adapted, and softened for external consumption. Series, documentaries, speeches. There was always an implicit message. They had come to organize the chaos we did not know how to handle. Their history was narrated as a painful ascent, full of mistakes, but culminating in a kind of moral maturity. They were the civilization that had learned from war and now guided the rest away from the abyss. It was a lie, but it was a beautifully told lie. When the intergalactic administration was created, a supposedly neutral coalition to mediate conflicts, regulate trade, and coordinate large-scale operations, most people sighed in relief. We comforted ourselves with the idea that there finally existed an instance above national interests, above races and factions. The symbol of the administration was simple: a circle of stars connected by lines of light. What almost no one noticed was who held that circle. In practice, all strategic coordination posts, all departments responsible for data and communication, all risk analysis and protocol design hubs were human. Other species were present, of course, but in secondary, ornamental, or easily replaceable positions. That is how the dictatorship was born without a single coup. I only realized we were living under a regime when it was already too late. The first clue came with the silence. Entire cities began to disappear from our internal transmissions. Economic districts went through restructuring. Whole communities were relocated to integration projects. The official justification was always the same: resource rationalization, production optimization, necessary adjustments to maintain the delicate balance of intergalactic peace. Few asked who defined that balance. We began to see more humans in key positions: advisors, supervisors, technicians. They infiltrated with a frightening calm, always smiling, always moderate, always reasonable. I remember the first inspection I witnessed in my city. I was too young to understand everything, but old enough to feel a discomfort no one dared to name. They did not carry visible weapons. They carried analysis devices, tablets, scanners. They walked the streets like doctors inside a sick body, recording symptoms, proposing improvements, diagnosing risks of social instability. In a matter of weeks, our local communication channels were integrated into the administration's optimized information flow mesh. From then on, even our silence was monitored. Any collective movement was automatically analyzed. Religious festivals began to have time limits. Certain rituals were redefined as potential generators of high emotional density gatherings. Spontaneous meetings were discouraged with gentle campaigns about safety and order. In the name of harmony, we unlearned how to gather for reasons that were not authorized. It was like that on Lethar. It was like that on dozens of worlds. The dictatorship did not begin with prohibition. It began with constant recommendation. The breaking point, however, did not come from us. It came from them. Humans have a trait that no other species has reproduced with such intensity: fear of return. They are afraid that everything they have done will come back to their own worlds. And it was that fear that pushed them to the next step: direct control over the internal narrative of each species. When the first isolated rebellions appeared in peripheral systems, small uprisings, acts of sabotage, protests, The administration realized that merely filtering news would not be enough. It was necessary to control what populations believed to be possible. Thus was born the Cultural Harmonization Program, a beautiful name for what was, in essence, a systematic intervention in the stories we tell about ourselves. Traditional songs began to be reinterpreted with new arrangements, lyrics altered to emphasize cooperation, submission, respect for intergalactic order. Literary works were updated with endings that were less dark, less ambiguous, less dangerous. Films and simulations began to be assessed by an emotional risk matrix. Anything that encouraged deep questioning, unresolved tragedy, heroes who challenged structures, was downranked, labeled as harmful to collective balance. It was in that period that my profession was declared illegal. I was a chronicler. In my culture, a chronicler is not just a storyteller. They are the one who observes the hidden thread between events, who records what must not be forgotten, who keeps both the glories and the shames of a people. Chroniclers have always been feared and respected because the truth they carry is rarely comfortable.
When the administration began to offer official historical record programs, many thought it was a recognition of our function. We were invited to join teams, to sit on committees, to help in the construction of healthy narratives for joint development. Some accepted. I did not. Perhaps that is why I am still alive. Little by little, I realized that the official versions of events were more important than the events themselves. Wars were renamed border adjustments. Genocides became overcome strategic errors. Violent interventions were transformed into stabilization missions. And, above all, any organized resistance was presented as an isolated incident of extremism. That was when I realized, if they alone defined the words with which the universe describes itself, the dictatorship would never be seen as a dictatorship. It would be seen as the natural form of order. I could not allow that. The first rebellion was not born of a speech, nor of a flag, nor of an attack. It was born of a silent refusal, the refusal to accept that words were administrative property. It all started with small anonymous files that began to circulate in the deep layers of the network, obscure regions rarely accessed, which human filters deemed low relevance. They were texts, recordings, fragments of memory, raw reports of interventions, disappearances, massacres, stories of entire worlds downgraded to resource extraction zones, testimonies from species that had lost their original language, replaced by a standardized dialect. I was one of many who started collecting this material. At first, my work was only to preserve. I stored it in disconnected systems, in memory crystals, in forgotten physical caches. I did not think in terms of rebellion. I thought in terms of testimony. I believed that even if we were crushed, someone one day would find that and know what really happened. But the universe is stubborn with its ironies. What began as an archive became a seed. Other chroniclers on other worlds started doing the same. Some did not even know the others existed. Even so, in a silent synchrony, the same impulse emerged. Refuse the official version, record pain without makeup. The administration's data prioritization failed to foresee a factor their models did not account for well: the almost instinctive need for meaning in the face of injustice. When these files began to cross, something new emerged, a pattern. We saw the same tactics being used in distant systems, the same phrases, the same justifications, the same decrees of temporary intervention that never ended. We saw that these were not isolated errors, but a logic applied with implacable precision. That was when fear gave way to fury. Even so, the first rebellion was not formed with weapons. It was formed with narrative. The great turning point came when one of these archives unintentionally leaked into a higher layer of the network. It was not the work of a genius, nor of a great hacker. It was carelessness.
Someone misconfigured permissions, and a collection of raw accounts of the destruction of a small agricultural system became accessible to far more species than it should have been. In a few cycles, copies multiplied. The administration reacted quickly. It classified the content as malicious misinformation, triggered alerts, blocked domains, hunted some suspects. But it was already too late. Not because everyone believed what they read, but because, for the first time, many began to doubt in a structured way. Until then, distrust had been diffuse, intuitive, restricted to niches considered overly sensitive. But now there was evidence. Not one, not two, but hundreds of different stories following the same pattern. The question that echoed across distant worlds was not, is this true? It was, why are they so desperate for us not to see this? That was the true beginning of the first rebellion. It did not start with gunfire, but with questions. Humans, accustomed to anticipating behavior with their predictive models, were slow to perceive what was forming. Their algorithms were brilliant at detecting physical threats, clusters of social unrest, fleet movements, abrupt changes in consumption or production. But they were slower to understand what did not follow a straight line of cause and effect: the slow corrosion of trust. When the administration finally detected the significant increase in access to unauthorized content, the loss of engagement with its official narratives, and the growth of unauthorized discussion circles, it reacted as all tyrannies do when they feel they are losing ground, by tightening its fist. New laws were passed in the name of information security. Certain layers of the network were cut off, certain protocols declared illegal. The very figure of the chronicler, in many cultures, was officially redesigned as a risk to social cohesion. That was when many of us disappeared.
I was only not taken in that period because I already lived in a fold between spaces, between my world and so many others. I had learned to hide, not my body, but the trail of what I left behind. Every account I transmitted, every memory I stored, was encrypted in multiple ways, fragmented, mirrored in dozens of systems. It was not genius, it was methodical despair. As the administration tightened the noose, a curious phenomenon occurred. Those who had previously been apathetic began to feel something new, the discomfort of seeing voices silenced in the name of a peace that felt increasingly strange. Many still believed in the humans, believed everything was exaggeration, enemy propaganda, but silently, a fissure had opened. The fissure through which revolutions are born. The first coordinated action of the rebellion was not spectacular. There were no explosions, no seizure of stations, no flags torn down. It was a boycott. In 3 different systems, entire populations refused simultaneously to consume official transmissions for 1 full cycle. It seemed like a small gesture, almost childish. The administration mocked it, classified it as another episode of collective hysteria. But for us, the chroniclers, it was the sign that the universe was starting to listen to itself. Soon after came the second action, a cascade of reports emerging in public layers, signed no longer by anonymous sources, but by real names. Survivors, former low-ranking human employees, technicians, retired soldiers. People who, for various reasons, decided that the lie no longer fit in their mouths. I remember the day I read the account of a former human logistics operator, detailing the rationalization of resources that resulted in the abandonment of entire colonies. His justification at the time had been simple: they didn't fit into the equation. Now, years later, he wrote with a guilt that corroded every line. It was upon finishing that document that I realized the rebellion was not only against them, it was against what they had taught us to accept. It was in that context that a group of us, chroniclers, data scientists, strategists, some ex-military, decided to give shape to what had until then been just a dispersed current, a movement. We had no name, we had no symbol, we had a principle: no truth would ever again be administered by a single species. We knew that we could not, at first, confront fleets, orbital weapons, and consolidated power structures. But we could confront the foundation beneath all of that, the narrative. We began to build what humans feared most, an alternative story. If you expected explosions from the beginning, you may find this origin disappointing. But this is how great downfalls begin, with the loss of control over the plot. The first intergalactic dictatorship will not fall when it falls, because someone fired the right weapon at the right time. It will begin to fall because at some point, it will cease to be convincing. I speak in the future because we are still at the beginning. Today, the administration still governs. Humans still control the main data flows. They still have fleets capable of erasing worlds. They can still suffocate isolated rebellions. But for the first time, they no longer hold the monopoly on interpretation. Chroniclers have begun to reappear on worlds that have never truly known freedom. Young people from many species are beginning to question not only what they are told, but how and why. Small groups gather in unmonitored zones, not to discuss weapons, but to discuss versions. And believe me, for a regime that sustains itself on the illusion of being inevitable, nothing is more dangerous than the realization that other forms of reality are possible. I am one of many responsible for igniting that realization. I am called traitor, agitator, interspecies threat. For some, I am just an old one who insists on recording pains the universe would rather forget. But for those who are no longer satisfied with the administration's artificial tranquility, I am something else. Proof that, even in the first intergalactic dictatorship, there are still places where the word slips through. You may want to know when the battles will come, when the worlds will rise, when humans will be confronted in open field. That part has not come yet, and if it has, it will be narrated by others in other times. My role is different. I am the voice that remembers how it was possible for a people, once victims of their own wars, to become the cold administrators of the fate of entire species. I am the one who refuses to let the dictatorship hide behind pretty words like order, security, balance. I am one of those who plant the stories that will feed the courage of those who have not yet been born. The first rebellion began when the universe stopped accepting only one version of itself. And that is why you are hearing this now.
Because as long as there is someone narrating what truly happened, the human dictatorship will never be absolute. And a regime that is not absolute, no matter how powerful it seems, has already begun to crumble. I wish I could say the first rebellion ended in triumph, that the truth tore through the administration's web of lies, and that oppressed peoples reclaimed the right to write their own history. But that would just be another elegant way of lying. And lies were already the human's favorite tool. The truth is far more brutal. We almost won. Forgotten. And it was precisely because of that they crushed us with a fury the universe has not yet witnessed. The rebellion was not born as an army. It was born as a correction of perspective. For years, we had gathered fragments, records of massacres renamed as stabilization operations, transcripts of mediation sessions that ended in annexation, internal reports of resource redistribution that, in practice, meant the emptying of entire worlds. Each isolated file looked like nothing more than an administrative mistake. But when we began to layer them together, the pattern emerged with cruel clarity. It was a pattern, always the same cycle. First, a narrative of aid. Then, the imposition of protocols. Next, informational control. Finally, irreversible dependency. The first rebellion was born the moment we realized this was not a string of accidents, but a method. At first, we didn't dare call it a rebellion. We were chroniclers, analysts, data scientists, survivors. Our initial goal wasn't to topple the administration, but to prevent it from monopolizing the truth. We created small, discrete cells on worlds that weren't at the center of the main routes. Agricultural planets, less strategic orbital stations, old colonies relegated to the function of labor stockpiles. In those places, we made the first truly dangerous decision: to voluntarily interrupt the flow of the official narrative.
Some worlds began to reject human cultural transmissions. Not explicitly. They simply prioritized local content, accidentally deleted certain sequences, delayed reception of major administration broadcasts. The populations still saw humans as allies, but their presence stopped being absolute. Meanwhile, in the deep layers of the network, the files kept circulating. I remember the first major compendium we helped assemble. Not a simple denunciation, but a comparative timeline between 5 different systems. In each one, the same script: the arrival of human consultants, the integration of communication infrastructure into the unified mesh, the entry of social risk specialists, the gradual replacement of local leadership by certified administrators, the appearance of informational security laws, the seizure of cultural symbols deemed sensitive, and finally, the transformation of the system into a logistics node or extraction zone. When that compendium began to circulate clandestinely, something changed. Suddenly, peoples who once thought their tragedy was unique began to realize they were part of a mosaic. Pain stopped being an isolated experience and became a diagnosis. And when pain gains a diagnosis, it stops being merely lament and begins to move toward strategy. The rebellion gained shape when the first act of physical resistance was carried out not by soldiers, but by workers. In the industrial belt of Vartes, workers from 3 different species were notified that their sector would undergo advanced automation. In practice, that meant mass dismissal, replacement by human-made machines, and forced relocation to remote work zones, often places of difficult return where human supervision was absolute. But the workers of Vartes were connected to the clandestine network. They knew, from the reports circulating among chroniclers, that automation was just the stage preceding full militarization of the facility. They knew that once they were relocated, they would lose any capacity for action. So they did something no administration predictive model anticipated. They emptied the facility on their own. While the station orbited in seemingly normal condition, they quietly evacuated families, key equipment, databases, and genetic seed vaults to nearby asteroids used as forgotten depots. The site was abandoned in an organized yet silent manner. When the human fleet arrived to assume control, it found only empty corridors, basic systems in safe mode, and automatic messages looping endlessly. The official version would later say that a structural collapse had made continued habitation impossible. But for a few days, the truth circulated in the depths of the network. An entire world had refused to sit and wait for the order to be removed. The rebellion was still underground, but in that moment, it ceased to be merely defensive. It discovered it could act first. From there, events began to chain together with dangerous speed.
In the Helion sector, an administration communication hub was hijacked by a group of technicians who, until then, were considered exemplary. Instead of simply taking the systems down, they inverted them. For a span of 53 minutes, recorded in dozens of cultures as the Hour of the Rift, official transmissions were replaced by raw footage from censored files. Images of forced evacuations, reports of mass disappearances, logs of worlds reclassified from autonomous to administered after cooperation failures. The administration, of course, reacted quickly. It shut down the broadcasts, labeled the episode as an informational terrorist attack, and accused extremist forces of spreading panic. But once again, it was too late. It no longer mattered what they said afterward. The images had already been seen. More importantly, the script of the lie had been exposed live. Worlds that had, until then, trusted the human protection narrative without question, began to perceive that when it came to preserving its own legitimacy, the administration was capable of rewriting anything: dates, numbers, motivations, intentions. And if everything could be rewritten, then nothing was trustworthy. It was at that stage that the rebellion stopped being a sum of isolated sparks and became something humans deeply feared: a coalition of consciousness. There was a meeting.
It never existed in the official records, but I was linked to it. It took place on an unnamed station, a decommissioned logistics outpost drifting in a forgotten orbit between trade routes. There, representatives of 4 different fronts gathered: chroniclers like me, former security officers from subjugated species, scientists working on alternative network models, and former low-level administration employees disillusioned by what they'd seen from the inside. There was no leader, but there was a shared understanding. Either we turned the rebellion into something more structured, or we would be hunted cell by cell. I left that station with a painful clarity. From that moment on, we would no longer merely record the advance of tyranny, we would confront it directly. And to confront directly a system that controls fleets, communication, economy, and memory is, by definition, to walk consciously toward death. Even so, no one backed down. The humans were slow to grasp what was happening. They saw signs, of course: noise in production reports, the disappearance of certain shipments, strange failures in peripheral antennas. But they interpreted it all as industrial sabotage, local instability, technical glitches. They were so used to predicting classic violent uprisings, explosions, invasions, military coups, that they didn't recognize a rebellion that organized itself first around stories and only later around weapons. The turning point was the so-called Siege of Nidras. Nidras was more than a world. It was a symbol. There sat one of the main coordination centers of the unified communication network. Not the largest, nor the most heavily protected, but the oldest. It was a place where, long ago, humans and other species had cooperated in research, exchange, and protocol maintenance. The universe saw Nidras as proof that the administration was open and multi-species. The rebellion chose precisely that place as its first act of open defiance. We did not attack Nidras with a fleet. We had no way to. We surrounded Nidras with something far worse for the administration: organized silence. Over a sequence of cycles, worlds linked to that node gradually reduced their dependence on the human network. Local systems, parallel networks, alternative channels were reactivated or created from scratch. When the right moment came, they did something simple and devastating. They disconnected from Nidras at the same time. Suddenly, that center which symbolized total control became an empty core, attached to a web that no longer wished to be fed by it. For most populations, this meant only delays in news, unstable services, minor glitches. But for the administration, it was a direct blow to the heart. For the first time, the unified network stopped being unified by the will of those at the edges, not by the order of those at the top. The human response was swift, harsh, and, for the first time, openly military. Emergency support fleets were dispatched to systems deemed disoriented. Human technicians arrived with trust restoration protocols. Ambassadors appeared with rehearsed smiles, speeches about misunderstandings, and veiled warnings about the risks of technological isolation. On many worlds, it worked. Fear always finds room where memory is still fragile. But on others, something had already solidified: the sense that it was better to be ignored by the administration than obeyed by it. When an agricultural planet in the Telem Belt formally refused to reconnect to the human network, everyone expected a direct retaliation: orbital bombardment, trade blockade.
The exemplary destruction that had always lurked between the lines as a threat. None of that came. Instead, the administration activated what they called Counter-Protocol Zero Helix. Mists make no sound. Tidal waves do. Zero Helix was a silent tide. Within a few days, all unofficial communications collapsed. Parallel networks were infiltrated without fanfare. Encryption tools used by the rebellion began to fail in subtle ways. Messages vanished, keys stopped working, servers we believed invisible started showing strange signals. What we thought was safe suddenly revealed itself completely exposed. Only later did we learn why. The humans weren't trying to bring down only the messages. They were trying to bring down trust in the very idea of a safe channel. The strategy was perversely elegant. Force us to distrust one another, the means we used, the routes we built. Each successful interception fed rumors of infiltration. Each failed operation spread suspicions of imaginary traitors. The rebellion had been born from the ability to connect pain. Zero Helix struck precisely at that stitching. Even so, some of us resisted more than the human algorithms had predicted. There were cells completely disconnected from the infrastructure they controlled, working with old, crude, sometimes analog technology. We risked death every time we used those means, but that very precariousness protected us. Nothing that wasn't plugged into the unified network could be struck by Zero Helix. It was thanks to that one last great act of defiance became possible. We called it the Invisible Assembly. There was no physical location, no central broadcast. It was a synchronized decision. In 23 different systems, resistance groups organized, in the same cycle, symbolic public demonstrations. Not armed, not violent, but absolutely clear. In squares, domes, temples, and markets, populations gathered without administration authorization, raised ancient symbols that had been discouraged, and projected into their skies written names that until then circulated only clandestinely. Names of destroyed colonies, dates of interventions, real numbers of disappeared. The administration was caught for a few hours without an answer. Any openly violent reaction would be recorded and inevitably compared with the archived material already circulating. Any soft response would look like weakness. They hesitated. That hesitation cost them more than they admit. For a brief instant, we believed the dictatorship might back down. But the human empire chose another path. I don't know exactly where the decision was made. I don't know if it happened in that restricted circle of human strategists who never appeared in public, or if it was a gradual escalation, fed by fear, pride, and cold calculation. But the fact is that shortly after the Invisible Assembly, the tone changed. There was no more talk of misunderstandings, no more appeals to cooperation, no more makeup. In their place came a declaration condensed into 3 terms that still taste like rust on my tongue: correction, containment, reclassification. It was the unofficial announcement of total war, not between armies, but between one species and all the others. The correction fleets appeared on the maps like controlled fires. First, they quietly surrounded a system suspected of subversive activity. They traveled under the banner of a support mission. They established contact with leaders still loyal or ambiguous. They proposed joint investigations, inquiry commissions. Meanwhile, troops landed in strategic locations supposedly to protect essential facilities. Next came the disconnections. Local data centers were temporarily integrated into human hubs for verification. When they returned, they came back amputated, with records erased, gaps justified as collateral damage from Zero Helix. Finally, reclassification decrees were issued. Worlds once considered integrated autonomous became special administrative zones. Peoples once treated as partners were officially relabeled as support populations. With each decree, the rebellion lost a piece of reality. But we did not just stand and watch. While the administration advanced with its machinery, some cells decided to do the unthinkable: confront the fleets directly. It was a strategic mistake. It was an inevitable act. It was a sacrifice. In the Run-Sal system, forces from 3 species, poorly armed, poorly equipped, without the cutting-edge technology humans flaunted, joined to block the entry of a correction fleet. They used debris fields, improvised mines, electromagnetic pulses adapted from orbital harvesters. For a moment, it worked. 2 human ships were damaged. 3 were forced to retreat to repair shields. The fleet became trapped in a tangled field of junk remotely guided by platforms camouflaged in asteroids. The image
Was seen by few, but I will never forget it. For the first time, the administration's symbol retreating before the improvisation of peoples they considered technically inferior. The response was disproportionate. Run-Sal was erased.
There was no broadcast, no warning, no ultimatum, only a pulse. When remote sensors tried to register the system, they found only noise, a curtain of permanent interference, as if even space itself had been disfigured. The administration called the event an irreversible quantum anomaly. But among us, the most frightening rumor of all spread. They had decided to test a weapon that did not just kill bodies, but erased traces of existence. Whether it was true or not hardly mattered. The message was clear. We would not cross that line again without paying with entire worlds. After Runsile, many stepped back, but many others understood something different. If the price of resisting was that high, then proof had been given to the universe, beyond all doubt, that there truly was a ruthless enemy, and not just a strict administrator. It was in that atmosphere that the last great leaders of the rebellion gathered. I was not physically present, but I had access to the memories of those who were. They met on a fragment of moon, partially hollow, used centuries earlier as a mining test site and now converted into a clandestine refuge. There were representatives of worlds that had not yet been completely crushed. Scientists, warriors, chroniclers, former local administrators who had finally broken with the machine they had once served. They knew they could no longer act like fine rain, seeping through the system's cracks. The enemy had identified the gaps. Zero Helix had sealed them. The correction fleets now came even where there was no explicit rebellion, only suspicion. They came to the most dangerous and most predictable conclusion. If they did not attack the core of the administration, it would destroy them one by one. They planned a single, concentrated, desperate offensive to strike 3 major human nodes simultaneously: 1 military, 1 informational, 1 economic. They did not seek to destroy the human species, but to temporarily paralyze its capacity for control, open a window of chaos in which dominated peoples could reorganize and perhaps establish an alternative structure. It was the closest we ever came to truly threatening their dominion. And it was, too, the perfect trap. Today, looking back through the cold lens of a chronicler, I see signs that the humans knew more than they let on. It is likely they had infiltrators, more advanced sensors than we imagined, predictive models, capable of anticipating not the exact plan, but its inevitability. When the offensive began, everything seemed at first surprisingly successful. On Karth Prime, an administration logistics hub, rebels managed to trigger a coordinated collapse of orbital shields, opening a breach through which improvised ships pierced into the inner cargo ring sectors. On Helion Delta, the information node, authentication systems failed in cascade, generating conflict among internal protocols. On Seriox Beta, the economic center, transactions were reversed, databases duplicated, energy reserves rerouted to ghost zones. For a few hours, the human empire staggered. Reports contradicted each other, divergent images circulated, official channels went offline. During that brief interval, many believed the fall had begun. That was when the true core of Counter-Protocol Zero Helix revealed itself. Until then, we had thought of it as a weapon against networks. We discovered, too late, that it was also a weapon for identifying rebel patterns on a massive scale. Every transmission of ours, even encrypted, every attack, every infiltration attempt, every manifesto we distributed, had fed, without our knowing, the human models, not just to stop us, but to map us, to understand how we thought, how we organized, how we reacted. When we attacked their main nodes, we gave them exactly what they needed: a point of convergence. At that moment, all major names, cells, and structures of the rebellion were active, emitting signals, moving, exposing their connections. What for us was mobilization, for them was opportunity, and they did not waste it. The so-called correction fleets, until then used as targeted instruments, were unified into a joint operation. Overnight, they began to act not as firefighters isolating blazes, but as a blade cutting through several veins at once. The rebel offensive had barely reached its peak when the surgical responses began. On Karth Prime, The improvised ships that had breached the cargo ring were suddenly neutralized by an internal pulse that shut down non-certified hybrid systems. Their occupants were captured, still stunned, cataloged, sorted by species, age, and function. There were no trials, there was triage. On Helion Delta, the informational chaos was turned against us. The administration pretended to have lost control for longer than it actually had. While we bragged in clandestine layers about having brought down the center, they were mapping the origin point of every one of those messages. When they came back on air, they did so with icy firmness, already with lists prepared. On Siriox Beta, the apparent confusion in energy reserves ended with the isolation of entire sectors where rebels were hiding. All it took was cutting oxygen, local gravity, and access to the recycling system. Not a single shot was necessary. It was not a battle. It was genocidal surgery. What came after was not war. It was a hunt. The best-known names of the rebellion were hunted with maximum priority. Some died in direct confrontations, refusing to flee. Others vanished in station corridors, never mentioned again. Others were displayed as examples, not killed, but reconditioned. I've seen recordings of some of these reconditionings. They weren't classical torture, not in the sense many cultures understand. They were dismantlings. The humans disassembled a person's identity as someone might open a mechanism, piece by piece. They took apart their history, questioned every memory, replaced terms, pointed out contradictions. They weren't trying to force confessions, but to implant narratives. In the end, the target ceased to be resistant and became useful. Some of these reconditioned individuals were sent back to their worlds as examples of reintegration. They spoke in the name of the administration. They told their own rebellion as a youthful mistake, as a delusion manipulated by dark forces. They knew they were lying, and the fact that they knew made everything even more cruel. Most, however, did not have even that privilege. Leaders identified as irrecoverable were simply erased. Not from official records, that would mean acknowledging they had existed. They were erased from stories. Entire worlds were reclassified, their old rulers replaced by administrators chosen directly by humans. Any mention of uprisings was described as supply crises, local anomalies successfully resolved. And the captured fighters, those who carried improvised weapons, disabled shields, sabotaged systems, were sent to a fate even more disturbing than death: perpetual labor under direct human supervision. It was slavery, wrapped in administrative terms. Mandatory productive relocation, maximum use of available human resources, post-crisis functional recovery programs. They were shipped to extraction asteroids, artificial solar plants, mobile platforms in radiation zones, places where the administration's presence was absolute and any external contact practically impossible. There weren't visible bars. There were routines. There were metrics. There were behavior scripts. Above all, there was the certainty that their stories would never be told. And we, the chroniclers, we were categorized as ontological threats. The existence of someone who records what must not be remembered was more dangerous to the administration than a rebel fleet. Fleets can be destroyed, files can be hacked, but a mind that has seen, understood, and can narrate is a permanent flaw in the system. I was hunted. Like all the others, I saw colleagues vanish after routine inspections. I saw entire libraries classified as obsolete, their contents selectively digitized, the rest quietly burned. I saw children who were once encouraged to hear their people's stories receive only approved simulations. I should have been captured in that same period. I was not, only because I already lived at the edge of formal existence, moving between abandoned stations, neutral zones, and ancient routes human algorithms considered economically unviable and therefore irrelevant. Relevance, after all, had always been their criterion. That is how I survived, by becoming, in their eyes, irrelevant. Today, when I look back and narrate the outcome of the first rebellion, I do not do it with the heroism many would like. We did not win. We did not topple the administration. We did not institute a new interspecies council. We got close enough to make them afraid. And when they finally grew afraid, they showed they were not administrators.
not pacifiers, not mediators. They showed they were conquerors who had learned to use bureaucracy in place of cannons. The first rebellion officially ended when the administration declared that order had been fully restored. But that is the official date. Unofficially, the first rebellion ended when the last major chronicler hub was destroyed. Its archive burned, its members listed as missing due to accidents in risk zones. I was not there when it happened. I was in transit, as so many times before. I carried with me a fragmented version of everything we had gathered. Now, as you hear this, it is that fragmentation I speak from. I am one of the last who remembers the rebellion not as myth, but as a living flaw.
A flaw because it did not overthrow the empire. Alive because it proved forever that the empire can be wounded. You may ask if it was worth it. If the price paid, billions enslaved, millions dead, worlds reclassified, stories erased, cultures mutilated, was justifiable in light of a result that, on the surface, left us even more subdued than before. As a chronicler, it is not my place to judge with the comfort of someone who watches from outside. I am not outside. I was part of it. I lost as much as I recorded. But I say one thing with the coldness only time grants. Before the first rebellion, the administration was inevitable. After it, it became merely powerful. Power can be overthrown. Inevitability cannot. The humans know this. They know that, although they killed our leaders, scattered our peoples, and turned most of the rebels into invisible labor, they did not manage to kill the one thing that truly makes us dangerous, the awareness that the universe could be different. And as long as that awareness exists, even in chains, exhausted, reduced to whispers in dark corridors of forgotten stations, the first rebellion will never be entirely in the past. It will be prologue. For some, the prologue to the second. For others, to many more. For me, it is above all proof. Proof that an empire willing to kill so much just to remain alive has already begun to rot from within. That is what I record. That is what I leave behind. Because if today I am only a fugitive carrying memories, one day someone will be more than that. And when that person appears, they will need to know they are not starting from zero. They are walking over the wreckage of a history that was meant to be erased, but which, despite everything, still breathes. In me, in you who listen, in every slave who, at the far edge of a forgotten platform, still silently asks, what if it didn't have to be like this? That thought is the true outcome of the first rebellion. And it is precisely that thought that the humans, with all their power, have never managed to fully enslave.